So communism was not all that good at scientific application. Communism was very good at promoting education. Like, that's one thing. It was genuinely great at that. The Soviets were better educated than the Western Bloc was. It could put people in schools. It could give universal education. They didn't have the same education for everyone. Like the proles had practical vocational training, and the smart kids went to advanced schools and so on. But they put everyone in school. They invested a lot in it. They invested a lot in research. They end up just making all kinds of discoveries, but but in the end, it was very unstable because the government could always go and blow up a scientific field just because they didn't like the metaphorical implications of it. And the people who were in charge of actual economic planning didn't like to make any changes for the same reason that bureaucrats and office workers don't like to make changes in anything in real life. It's it's a pain in the ass, and it runs the risk of making their job obsolete. Well, communism was also going to breed violence and despotism. See, if the government had been responsive to the desires of the people, if the people had actually gotten to vote, that would have created some pressure to reform the system and run it properly. But they wouldn't get that. And the very nature of the ideology meant that it couldn't be anything other than what it was. The whole ideology revolves around the central planning. If you compromise the central planning, it's not communism anymore. There's no point to what you're doing. The party held all of the keys because it had all of the resources in hand. There was no power base from which they could affect change. So these states start out trying kind of to practice something like democracy, but it very quickly turns into a very repressive and violent dictatorship. The USSR is a federal government, right? It's a union of republics, just like we're a union, but everything's going to be run from Moscow. Everything ends up going back to Gosplan. It all ends up going back to the planners working with their little accounting books on their computers, deciding who gets wheat and who gets shoes and who gets ore and all of that. And when the communist superstates tried to change, it ended up changing their political systems as well, and vice versa. Now, communism also inevitably bred violence and dictatorship. And I think I already got like pretty far into this with you. But the nature of the ideology meant that it couldn't be anything else. As long as it had that highly centralized economic system, as long as it had this command economy, it was naturally going to evolve into an authoritarian state. If you're going to use a dictator's means to run your country, dictates from above, you're going to have a dictator. As long as the keys to power were so tightly controlled, as long as there were so few and it was so hierarchical, every facet of life was going to be controlled by the state, including the ability to choose who runs the state. In a world where individuals have no individual power over their own lives, how are they going to exercise power through a vote? How are they going to exercise power through dissent? The state controls all of the literal physical resources. The state is also run by corrupt human beings, and it's going to defend the interests of those human beings. And so you get no power base from which you can affect change. But in the end, the system was just so inefficient that it could not last. And we first start to see real change in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So throughout the early 1900s, they're just trying to survive. Throughout the mid 1900s, that's kind of their glory days, where on the inside it's emaciated corpses everywhere, but from the outside it looks like they're healthy. But by the late 1900s, they had run out of juice. They had expanded as much as they could. They had caught up and still fell far short due to the calculation problem. And they're stuck in these endless quagmires, in endless confrontations with the West, where we're suckering each other into wars. Go fight in Vietnam, dummy. Go fight in Afghanistan, dummy. And the Russians can't afford it. They just can't pay for all of these battles. A country like North Korea can limp along forever because it basically uses its nukes as a way to shake down its neighbors for foreign aid. But Russia is the one that's paying for everyone else's wars. And so they finally start to loosen up on both the economic and political fronts. They implement what was called glasnost and perestroika. So we're going to allow people to run limited private businesses. We're not going to like denationalize the big things, the coal and iron and all that, but we're going to allow more private businesses, right? We're going to be cautious with this, and we're going to allow dissent. And this is being done under the dictator Mikhail Gorbachev. And the problem was they quickly lost control of the process. By allowing people to run some businesses, now people had some more power from which they could support their dissent. And by allowing some dissent, it revealed to the country just how bad things were. And it leads to this virtuous cycle where the authority of the state quickly unraveled. When the Communist Party allows this, it just gets way out of control in the space of a decade. And by the end of it, you have open insurrections in all of the Soviet puppet states. You have open insurrections within the Soviet Union itself. And the Soviet Union essentially abolishes itself. It doesn't collapse in a civil war, but they realize this is what's called the fall of communism, and sometimes you'll hear the expression velvet revolutions used to describe it too. Same era as the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's so much dissent, there's so much consensus among regular people that the communists have to go, that the communists don't stand and fight, and they just let it happen. Now, for much of Eastern Europe, this is a good thing, but for the Soviet Union itself, this is going to turn out to be disastrous, because along comes America, and America, which was very capitalist at the time, tells them what the best thing you can do is just go as hard in on capitalism as you can. They call it economic shock therapy. And turns out it's not a good idea, because even though a less regulated economy is generally more efficient, the problem is their whole system, it was based around command structures. It was based around people taking orders from someone else. It was all very centralized, so they have a lot of state monopolies. And when they privatize these industries, It's going to be the elite, the party apparatchiks, who buy everything up. And so their industry just kind of collapses overnight. When they pull out all of the structure, all of the like chain of command that was getting, resources where they needed to go, nobody knew what to do with it. They have the machinery and they have the workers, but that doesn't mean that a market that a fully fledged market is just going to spring up overnight. Markets spring up anywhere they're allowed to, but it takes them time to develop. It was as though the West expected them to plant a seed and have a whole fruit orchard the next day. And so while the other Eastern Bloc countries end up making a lot of progress, in the Soviet Union itself, their standard of living actually takes a nosedive when communism ends. And it's not until like a full decade or two later that it begins to recover. I have a friend, Stanislav Kolpakov, who goes here, and Stan grew up during this period. He was born in a little quarter of Moldova called Transnistria. And like the Donbass and Luhansk, it had this secession movement, still has it to this day. This secession movement, they were ethnic Russians who did not want to be part of Moldova. They wanted to stay part of the Soviet Union. And so they were fighting a war for independence. And Stan is a teenager when the Soviet Union falls. Eventually, he ends up immigrating to Romania, and then he travels the world to places like Qatar and Germany and Latin America. Gets a job working for the airlines, and finally he makes his way to the United States on a lottery and becomes a citizen, and now he's an economist himself. I met him through the program, but for Stan, this was his life because he sees when the union falls, hyperinflation happens, everyone's out of work, old people were being murdered for their apartments. I learned about this in Russian history class like a decade ago. They had these gangs that were running around basically forcing old people to sign like contracts giving them the apartment, and then they would just murder the old person to get them out of the way. And that happens to like Stan's music teacher. That blew my mind. Well, when I'm like, holy crap! I actually met someone that this happened to, but it wrecks the place. And because the elites buy everything in the auctions, you end up with a very unequal society afterwards. Nothing changed. It was the iron law of oligarchy. It was that tendency that revolutions, in the end, all they do is kill people and don't. They never make meaningful, lasting change. Mayday, mayday. One, two, three. And this is one of the reasons why the average Russian boomer supports Vladimir Putin so much. Because the recovery started around the time that Putin took power. It wasn't necessarily him that caused it, but you know how it goes. Just like in this country, people attribute everything to whoever currently runs the country. And, from their perspective, he basically saved them from starvation. That's why so many Russians will wax poetically so much about the Soviet period. From their perspective, communism industrialized them, gave them a great empire, gave them an empire that had a lot of things to be very proud of. And then when it went away, their lives became objectively worse. Now you can look at it from our perspective and you can see how, everywhere else this is applied, it doesn't turn out that way. You can even take a longer term view, but if you're talking to an 80-year-old Russian grandma living out in Siberia, the kinds of people that they call Putin country, in the same way that there's Trump country. How are you going to argue with their own experience? That's something people have to understand if they're going to understand conflicts like the one in Ukraine at the moment. You have to know where people are coming from, even if they're wrong. Now, the Chinese, they're going to watch what happens in Russia, and they're going to say, oh, no, thank you. Now, China doesn't really hit its super extreme phase until the 70s. So with Russia, it's in the 30s under Stalin. China, they become communist a little later, so they're a little more delayed. Chairman Mao is horrible for the country. And he's so bad that it leaves a bad taste in the mouths of his successors. They're not going to wait a long time. By the 80s and the 90s, they're already saying, okay, communism's not working. We tried the most extreme, rabid version of communism of everyone. We even had a falling out with the Russians because our version of communism was holier than theirs. And this isn't going to work. But we cannot loosen things up too much because we've seen if we loosen things up too much, we will lose power and it might tank the economy. And so what China's going to do is they're going to adopt a different system, a sort of third way approach that they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And what are these Chinese characteristics, pray tell? Well, it's things like having private property and a market that sets prices. And people can choose what place they want to work at. So in other words, it's American characteristics. It's British characteristics. It's not socialism and it's not Chinese either. But that's their way that they can put a communist face on it and not have to actually practice communism anymore. But the government is not going to loosen up everything. They're still going to have rules like you have to live in this city and you have to get a permit if you want to move to a different city. You have to, they're still going to have extensive price controls. They're still going to have extensive wage controls. They're going to have a lot of nationalized industries, right? The heavy industries will still be in the hands of the state. It's the little stuff that will let, regular people do. The government is going to be heavily involved in the managing of the economy in the same manner that you would expect in a fascist society. And in the end, China effectively turns itself into a fascist country. They take on the extreme nationalism. They don't really take on so much of the super traditionalist values, but they take on the nationalism. They take on the kind of unifying national mythos where all of the social classes are in it together instead of promoting class war. They take on endless saber rattling at their neighbors. And they also take on a corporatist economic system. And it allows them to grow, but it grows in a controlled manner where the state makes sure that it doesn't open up keys to power that, might undermine the state itself. It's in the 90s that China begins to boom, that it begins to have this massive growth. But it's managed growth, and it ends up stalling out just a few years ago because it's still not as efficient of a system as the one that the Western world practices. And thus you get China as we know it today, a state that calls itself communist, that's run by a Chinese Communist Party, and yet is not Marxist in any meaningful sense. A state that, in the end, turned into the very thing that communism claims to fight: a corporatist, inegalitarian, fascistic empire. But it was that willingness to compromise that allowed it to grow at all. It grew into its limits, which were apparently rather low, but grow it did. There are a lot of stories you could tell about how the world came to be the way it is. The one that I shared with you, the one that I themed this whole unit around, is the most mainstream in today's economics. You'd be exposed to it in pretty much any class. Usually they wouldn't go into the same level of detail as I do, but it has more explanatory power than any other set of conditions combined. Resources plays a role, and yet clearly resources isn't sufficient to explain it all. Culture plays a role, and yet culture can't explain it all. Technology plays a role, but technology can't explain it all. There were a lot of countries that had a great deal of potential. We've seen countries that had everything going for them and they threw it all away. And we've seen countries that had the world stacked against them and yet they managed to overcome it. But what links them all together is the institutions that they built and the way those institutions would play off each other. Because the political and the economic could not be separated. Political freedom and economic freedom had to go hand in hand. Technological progress was the only thing that could drive economic growth in the long run. And it depended on entrepreneurship. It depended on opportunities for entrepreneurship, a profit motivation. Wherever a small gang of thugs runs the show, you're going to get brutality and poverty, because that kind of system cannot abide competition with itself. And that kind of system is ultimately very fragile. It can only protect itself by destroying everything outside of it. If you allow a space for freedom, it's going to grow and grow. It's going to crack the foundations of it. That's what happened with Western democracy. It was a long time in coming. But when it came along, the world was transformed. It's transformed in the blink of an eye. And so that brings us to the end of this unit, brings us to the end of our story. There are a lot of different stories you could tell. This is one of the most mainstream ones. It's one that I personally believe in, but it's also one that you would be taught, I think, in most economics classes across the country. It's considered orthodox. There were many factors that led to the world looking the way it does. Things like resources do matter. Things like climate matters. Things like culture matters. But at the end of the day, none of those things in isolation can give us the full picture. They can't explain every different case. The one explanation that seems to most systematically explain every culture's experience is this idea that it's all driven by institutions, and particularly by that interaction between economic freedom and technological change, and between political systems and economic systems. The world runs on this creative destruction, constantly reshaping our environment. And the creative destruction, it can only flourish in an atmosphere of freedom. It can only flourish in a land where people have the right to do as they would. And a place like that has to be democratic. And the same is true in reverse. You can't explain the modern world just as an accumulation of scientific ideas. In large part because up until the second industrial revolution, it was always technology that drove science instead of the other way around. Most of your inventions are basically just different kinds of tool. They're things that are created by trial and error and by craftsmen tinkering in their workshops, fooling around in their workshops. It's not until you get to a modern era that you actually need scientists and R&D teams to develop something new. Something like, say, your modern day pharmaceuticals laboratory. But we would have never gotten to that point if it wasn't for the civilization that capitalism built. In the end, capitalism and democracy went hand in hand in making the world as we know it, because capitalism and democracy sprang from the same source. A set of values, they believe that every person should have the right to have some say in the world that they live in. That it should be made by the efforts drawn in little parts of everyone, and not just from the vision of one person or of one group of people. So that's it for this unit. I have just one video left for you, or, set of videos, topic, and that's my concluding address. It's the speech, part of it extemporaneous, part of it composed, that I give at the end of my semesters in person. And in it, the big theme is going to be looking at the values of socialism and capitalism in a way that I think might be surprising to you. And also some final thoughts on why it's important that we remember communism. Some justification of why I would spend so much time including it in an economics course, even though it looks like a marginal ideology in today's world. I'll see you in that one.